Okay, so now we're going to turn academic and focus back in that direction. You notice that even when I preach, I can't resist a little bit of teaching. But at any rate, so here we go with the Torah. This is going to launch off of one of the comments I made in the sermon about the way that Torah fits into the book of Exodus. And so to try to understand Torah, one of the difficulties is that in English, we tend to try to translate Torah by the word law. And that gives all the wrong impressions. So we're going to work with Torah, not the word law, but the word Torah. We'll talk about why that isn't really a very helpful translation and try to get a new vision of what Torah was for the Israelites. Because again, we can't figure out what it should mean to us until we figure out what it meant to them. Because it's not to us, but it is for us. Okay, so that's kind of outlining what we're doing. Instead of doing it with creation, we're doing it now with Torah. Same principles. So this PowerPoint presentation has the same cultural river slides and all of that, but I'm going to skip all those because you had those yesterday. And we're going to move right into the material. So we know that there are legal texts from ancient Mesopotamia. The most well-known is the Hammurabi stele, which is pictured on the right there. And these legal texts were predated the time of Moses by hundreds of years. And yet they have some provisions that sound very much like some of the things that we have in the Torah, in our Bibles. And when these were first found, that posed some difficulties because those who were very skeptical of the Bible and didn't want to treat it as God's word, it gave them another excuse to say, see, this stuff existed long before. The Israelites just kind of copied that same stuff and said, oh, God gave it to us. Okay? And so, again, people didn't know what to do with that. Because if the Torah was given from Sinai and the Ten Commandments and these things, then how could have they already existed? You know, so that was baffling and troublesome. So I think I can help sort that out when we look carefully at these legal texts from the ancient world. First of all, this was when it was found in 1902, it was dubbed the Code of Hammurabi. That's already a tendentious, arguable label, because code implies a code of law, a codified statutory law. And so by labeling that, it already assumes that that's what this document holds. It turns out that's wrong, okay, but it still persists that people think of it in those terms. Okay? We find out, and this has taken decades and decades of study by lots of different people, coming from lots of different angles, find out that it's not actual legislation at all. I can't go through the whole sequence of logic that leads to that, but one of the main features of it is that this is not comprehensive. A code of law has to be somehow comprehensive, covering all the areas that legislation would do. But this is not legislation. And in fact, we've discovered that they really don't have anything like legislation in the ancient world. Kings make decrees, but kings don't make laws. Okay, so there is no legislative process, no legislative body, no legislative literature, no legislative corpus that the judges use when they're trying to try cases. Nothing like that exists in the ancient world. And the history of those ideas has been traced. I didn't do it, but I appreciate those who did. Traced through the history of law. When did we start thinking about statutory law? When did we start developing legislative bodies? And it's all much more recent than you would think. And it's not in the ancient world. So this is not legislation. There is no obligation that's carried in these provisions. They're formulated as case law. If somebody does this, then this is what you do. So it's formulated in casuistic case terms. Okay, but still, that's not to say, and that's the law of the land. No, it wasn't working that way. Then after people figured out it wasn't legislation, then they thought maybe these are sample verdicts, the best of the best. Let's pull out the wisest and the best verdicts and showcase those. Well, but again, it turns out that was not the case either, that it doesn't work in those terms. There's a lot other things going on here. And again, I'm sorry I can't go through the details. Some of the details are in the Lost World of the Torah book, where I track it a little more. So you can see, though, the whole question is, what is this? We can translate it, but what genre? What's it doing? What's it trying to accomplish? And finally, this was placed in the context of other Mesopotamian literature, from which we find out that the Babylonians especially loved lists. Some of you are list people. I'm a list person, but my lists are to-do lists. Although every once in a while I make up a list of something, a list of all this or a list of all of that. And I might even share that list with somebody just as kind of an observation of, oh, isn't this cool? This is kind of everything that I know about this. Bibliography is a list of good books, or a list of books I used, things like that. So, but they were list people. And for them, their lists were for the purposes of wisdom. Okay, so they made wisdom lists. Now, they did that in a variety of areas. They did it in Proverbs. I mean, that's what our book of Proverbs is, too, in the Bible. It's a list of proverbial sayings. Okay, and they had lists of omens. They had lists of medical diagnoses or symptoms and remedies. They had lists of the gods, because there were a bunch of them. And so lists, and the list was for the purpose not of writing a Wikipedia, but a list for the purpose of wisdom, because for them to gather all that together in a list was an act of wisdom. Remember what I said about wisdom yesterday? Wisdom is the path to order. And so they sought wisdom because in that wisdom they hoped to find order and understanding. So all of these different categories where they compiled lists were all for the purpose of wisdom. And so it's been concluded that that also is going on here. They have gathered these legal provisions. I'm trying to use provisions as a neutral term. Paragraphs. These legal provisions were gathered for the sake of wisdom. Okay? So again, statutory law is not attested, so it's not that. But for them, justice equals order. So if you come up with a list of all of the things that you can do that will help establish justice, then that is a list that will lead to order in society. Even today, of course, we talk about law and order, right? I mean, we get this. That if there's anarchy, if there's chaos, if there's crime, if there's violence, if there's, all of that is disorder. We even call it disorderly conduct. Okay, so we get this idea of order. It's not just an ancient thing. So for them, justice equals order. It's interesting, in Mesopotamia, the gods had no interest in justice for justice sake. They even have a god of justice, Shamash, the sun god, but they don't even describe him as a just god. But he's interested in justice. He's in charge of justice because justice brought order. Remember, the gods in the ancient world, the gods' use of people was to take care of them. Pamper them, feed them, house them, clothe them, amuse them, pamper them in every way. That means that the gods had to be interested in justice, because if there was not justice in society, the people could not do what the gods needed them to do. Right? If you're afraid to go out of your house because you'll get murdered, you can't go to the temple and bring your gifts. If there are renegades setting fire to the fields, then you won't have any food to give to the gods. The gods had a vested interest, not an idealistic interest, but a vested interest in justice. So society would move smoothly and everybody could live their lives doing what they're supposed to do, bring offerings to the gods. So this is a piece, these lists of legal provisions were giving wisdom to bring about justice, because that reflected order in society. So they reflect the legal wisdom that will enhance the reputation of the king, because the king has been appointed by the gods. And if the king doesn't do his job, that is making sure the gods get pampered, right? I mean, think about, how we kind of stereotype mobsters and organized crime. You got the boss at the top, and he's got his lieutenants and his captains, and their job is to run their districts so that the proceeds keep coming into the organization. And if somebody's not producing, bringing in the proceeds of the rackets and all of that, well, then they're not any good anymore. You put somebody else in that place. But it's all to feed the coffers of the people at the top. Okay? Same system. Ancient gods were mobsters. Okay, so... and the whole thing then, this will enhance the reputation of the king. That is, he's a strong leader, enforcer, producer for the god. And that's what the god wants. Just think of a religious system like that. The religious system in Mesopotamia did not have any ethical mandates. The only obligation you had in the Mesopotamian religious system was to take care of the needs of the gods. It didn't matter how you lived. Again, if you were an agent of injustice or disruption of order, then the gods were upset with you, not because of ethical violations, but because you were disrupting the system that was feeding into their coffers. So how striking it was when Yahweh tells the Israelites, he says, notice people, I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. So if I were hungry, I wouldn't ask you. He is not a God who has needs. And it throws the whole religious system of thinking out of whack. So, the reputation of the king was to be enhanced by following this wisdom. These wisdom lists then were for practitioners. Okay, so if a doctor wanted to know how to deal with it, well, they could look up the wisdom of the medical texts. Or the diviner who wanted to figure out the meaning of something that he observed in the heavens. Well, he's got lists to try to give him wisdom to know how to do that job. And likewise, the judges could look at these not to get what the ruling has to be, but rather wisdom to make a wise ruling, to give a sound verdict. And if all of that happens, and there's order in society, then the king is a successful king, and the gods will be pleased. In fact, on the Hammurabi stele, you've got Hammurabi on the left, you can barely see him, he's standing. Shamash, the god of justice, is sitting. Shamash is not giving Hammurabi laws. You can see he's holding out something. It's a ring and a rod. Okay, and when this was first found, people said, oh, he's giving laws to Hammurabi, because they were thinking about the Bible. Okay, he's giving laws to Hammurabi, the god giving law. But then as we learned more and more about that, we said, oh no, he's not giving them to Hammurabi. In fact, Hammurabi, as the text tells us, is reporting this to the god. Hammurabi is saying what he has done in society, not what the god has given him to do. And then they finally figured out that they said, well, so Shamash is giving Hammurabi the authority to make laws. Here we go. But no, that's not it either, because Hammurabi's not making laws. He's not doing legislation. So then finally, now I think we've got it straight. They finally figured out what he's doing. He's not giving Hammurabi anything. He's showing Hammurabi, I've got authority. This is his symbol of authority that he's holding out to see. Here's my badge, I'm FBI. That kind of thing. Okay? So again, people go through, there's phases of interpretation of these things before sometimes we get them figured out. Okay, so Mesopotamian legalists fits into the genre of list wisdom, and it's aspective. Now, that's not a word you use often, probably. Okay, what do I mean by that? Aspective means it gives certain aspects of the idea of justice. In other words, it's giving a bunch of examples. Think about when you learned math in 8th grade or something, right? The teacher was trying to teach you mathematical principles. And they did that by sending you home with a whole list of problems that you had to solve. Okay, so when a train leaves Chicago at 2:10 in the afternoon going 34 miles an hour towards St. Louis, and a train leaves St. Louis heading towards Chicago, going such and such a speed, when will they cross? And Now, that's not so you can learn train timetables. The teacher doesn't care if you know train timetables, and in fact, they're not even realistic train timetables. It's so you can learn math. That always unfortunately led my son I would say, John, have you done your homework? He said, no. I said, well, why not? He says, I already know how to do it. I don't have to practice. 30 questions are wasting my time. No. Okay, but aspective means it gives certain illustrations. If you ever had an Art 101 course, one of the first questions probably the teacher asked was, what is art? What is art? And you start talking about what's art and what's not art, and Rembrandt comes up, and Picasso comes up, and Jackson Pollock, you say, huh, really? And, what is art? And by the time you're done, you find out that you can't define art. This is art. You can't define art, but you can kind of put a lot of dots on the board of this is art, and this is art, and this is art, and this is art. And you can draw a circle around the dots and say, that's art. See, that's aspective. Different aspects of what could qualify as art. So likewise, we find in these legal lists, and really in all the lists in Mesopotamia, they're aspective. They're giving illustrations, so that somehow by looking at all those illustrations, you can come up with a sense of what is justice, what brings order. And really, when you think about it, our book of Proverbs is the same thing. Nobody looks at the book of Proverbs and thinks that it's comprehensive. Every aspect of behavior to bring order and wisdom. It's aspective, different, these one-line proverbs all through it. By the time you're done, you're supposed to have a sense of what wisdom is and order that comes from that wisdom. But there are lots of things that aren't there. You see the difference? So that's the idea of being aspective. So again, we have these kinds of texts in the ancient world. Our earliest literary texts of any language are the Sumerian lists of Proverbs. 2800, 2700 BC. Sumerian lists of Proverbs. Interesting. Anyway, so these are the kinds of lists we find. They're examples. So in these legal lists, they're examples of what justice would look like to equip practitioners. You want to do justice. What's that look like? Here's some examples. This would be a good example of justice. This would be a good example of justice. Aspective, covering different kinds of things. Okay, examples of what justice would look like. They circumscribe, kind of put it all of these things in the circle, like art, all the dots. So they circumscribe and they describe. They do not prescribe. In other words, again, this is not legislation. Legislation would be prescriptive. Prescriptions. This is what you have to do. These are the rules. These are the obligations. That's prescription. This is circumscription and description. As a result, it does not come with any mandate or obligation, yet you ignore it at your peril. Again, think of the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is not commands, but it's wisdom, so you ignore it to your peril. And we want to try to live by the book of Proverbs because we recognize its importance, not because somebody's saying you have to do it or you'll get in trouble. So they circumscribe and describe. So, legal texts. Get your phone cameras out. Anyway, lists of examples were used to circumscribe wisdom connected to a particular area with the result that the practitioners could understand concepts and apply them to their work. In the legal realm, these documents were neither legislative, dictating morality, nor social systems rules. They gave wisdom from the king about what justice would look like, so the king and the people could exalt the names of their gods. Now, this exercise that we've just done is an exercise in trying to understand the ancient world with the hopes that that might give us insight into the biblical world. When we turn our attention to Torah in the Bible, we can recognize that here we may indeed have wisdom lists. But we're not going to jump to a conclusion, right? Because this might be a similarity, but it might be a difference. So we can't assume that Israel will be the same. But if there are no examples of legislative action in the ancient world, okay, and if the ancient world thought that way, this aspective lists way, then there's a high likelihood that Israel thought the same way. After all, why should we assume that God introduced statutory law to them and legislation as we know it? We don't want to assume our cultural river. We want to try to place it in its cultural river. So my default is going to be something more along this line, though recognizing that Yahweh is different from the gods of Babylon. And therefore, that might introduce some differences. But again, you always have to be willing to go with your evidence, see where it takes us. But this gives us a new starting point to evaluate the legal lists in the Torah. And then we'll find out if it fits or doesn't, and how we might have to make adjustments. So, when we get to legal lists in the Old Testament context, so we cannot assume labels such as legislation or moral system. Those are often presuppositions from our cultural river. Because we read the word law. And we think of the law as legislation. We think of the law as a moral system. And I'm just suggesting we can't start with that presupposition. The legal lists are not that in the ancient world. Maybe Israel's different. But we can't start assuming that this is a morality system or a legislative system. We would have to be able to demonstrate it. So, we've got the question then, okay, but these are presented as revelation from God. So, what makes them revelation? Think of yourself out on the plains of Mount Sinai with the Israelites. You've just come out of Egypt, and there you are. We're back to Sinai again. I did the golden calf yesterday, okay? But there you are, and you hear that God is going to speak from the mountain, and you're all eager and anxious. You know, thunder and lightning like last night. And then the booming voice from heaven, "You shall not kill." At that point, what are they thinking? I mean, is this something Really? We've never heard that before. What a glorious insight. We shouldn't just kill anybody we want. I can't go tent to tent slitting throats anymore. Oh, well, it was such fun. No. This is not new information. Right? You find it in Hammurabi. You find it in the ancient world. It was never acceptable for people to murder. And in Israel for 400 years, in Egypt, Israel in Egypt for 400 years, it's not like they felt perfectly free to murder whoever they wanted. Remember, Moses could have been accused of murdering this Egyptian and he had to flee for his life. Murder was not acceptable. And recognizing that, now we have another serious question. So, if this is not new information, not surprising, not something that already existed, if it's not that, then why did God bother coming down to the mountain to say it? You don't need a booming voice to tell them something that they already knew. And it's not just murdering, it's kind of so many of the things that are in Torah are things that were likewise practices among other peoples. Yet, the Bible makes a pretty big deal about Torah. That this is God's revelation to his people. But if the provisions aren't new, maybe some are, but a lot of them aren't. If the provisions aren't new, then what's going on here? Again, we have to ask the question before we can start thinking about the answer. So what constitutes revelation here? And that's what we want to try to figure out as we go along. Oops. So, if we work on the premise that these are collections of legal sayings for wisdom purposes, we suddenly are struck by the fact of something that lots of us knew already. Torah equals instruction. That is, Torah is a wisdom category word, not a legislation category word. And in fact, when you read in Deuteronomy about the Torah, its purposes are for wisdom. And furthermore, when you read Proverbs, you find out that Proverbs also are in some ways considered Torah instruction for wisdom. So we've been barking up the wrong tree here. We've been ringing around the legislation tree and the morality tree because of our cultural river, instead of recognizing what the terminology itself tells you is true. The Torah is given as instruction for wisdom, not as legislation for morality. But you say, wait a minute. In the Torah, it keeps saying that we need to obey. So that sounds like it's carrying some serious obligation. Wait a minute. Check the Hebrew. Always a good idea. What we translate as obey is the combination of the verb shama and the preposition beit. Shama ba. When you study Hebrew, you learn that combination equals obey. No, it doesn't. It means exactly what it says. Shama is the word hear, listen. So heed something. You heed wisdom. Proverbs, you can't obey them. Right? You go to the book of Proverbs, you don't really talk about obeying Proverbs. You heed the wisdom of the Proverbs. And then you keep it. Shamar, that's the other thing you do with Torah. Shamar, you keep it, you preserve it. So you heed it and you appropriate it. It's not a matter of obedience. It's bigger than that. One of the problems when we make Torah a list of rules is that we are then inclined to check them off. Got it. Yeah. Remember the ruler who came to Jesus said, what do I have to do to get eternal life? Well, have you kept the law? I did this and this and this and this. Got my checklist. You want to see it? And For Jesus, he would say, well, that's a good start. But then what does he tell him? But here's an idea. Go sell all that you've got. Didn't see that coming. Right? But that's the idea. It's not like Jesus was adding something new to the Torah. He was saying Torah is more than checking off lists. Torah is more than keeping a bunch of rules. It's the Pharisees that made it that. And that's not a model we want to follow. It's hard to think that the Pharisees found joy in the Torah. They found it a challenge to overcome. They found it a burden to bear. But that's not the psalmist's view. The psalmist delights in Torah. Because Torah is God's revelation to them of how they can live in His presence. It's wisdom for order living in God's presence. So, you're supposed to heed. You're supposed to observe. The obligation is not the obligation of rule keeping. The obligation is the obligation of living in wisdom. And you can't do a checklist with that. So the Torah itself, whether you call it the 16 laws with Maimonides or whatever, it's aspective. It's illustrations. It is not comprehensive. It is not statutory law. So, here's the difference. Here is the difference. In Mesopotamia, the legal lists are for the sake of justice to bring order so the gods can be pleased. God's being pleased, of course, is the issue. But for Israel, God being pleased is not being fed. So how do you please the God of Israel when you're not in this codependent situation? You please the God of Israel not by just having justice. There's a bigger issue. Holiness. Which does not exist in Mesopotamian thinking. There's no equivalent word. No equivalent concept. Now, for this, then, we have to understand what holiness is. We read in Leviticus 19:2, most of your translations say, "Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." Now, my son caught me on this one. He does it all the time. His dad talked to me about that verb form. I said, he says, is it imperative? You're translating it as imperative, be holy. Is it an imperative? I take a look at it, and I say, well, of course. Oh, no, it's not. What is it? It's an imperfect form, it's indicative. So how do you translate it? Come on, Dad. You are holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. That's a different thing. He proceeded to give me about a half-hour lecture on holiness. Thank you, son. He said, holiness is not something that you can achieve on your own. It's not something that you pursue. It's not something that you can lose. It's a status that is given, not an objective to be achieved. And when God says you are holy because He said you are. And if God says you are, you are. He's never preached a sermon in his life except at me. So he said, Israel wasn't under obligation to be holy. God made them holy. And He made them holy by adopting them as His people. And when you make something holy, you bring it into the realm of divine identity. That doesn't mean they were gods, but they were identified with God by His choice. And by the status that He gave them, they were brought into this divine identity. Just like things that were consecrated. Same word as holy, just a verb to make it holy. You make it holy by passing it into the realm of the divine. That's why it's no good for human use. Okay? So, holiness is what God gives Israel. A status. Not their own identity. In fact, it's not their identity anymore. They have become part of His identity, as He has made them His people. And Torah now is not just rules for living. It's not just how to accomplish justice in your society so gods can be fed. Torah is how you can live a life that reflects well on me because I have identified with you. And what you do affects me.
That's right.
I gave my other son that lecture when I dropped him off at college. No, I didn't drop him off. He went to Wheaton. And kind of the last conversation I had with him before he kind of absorbed into the student body was, I know you're an adventurous and mischief-loving guy, Josh, but I work here. And what you do reflects on me. You cannot avoid it. It's a status that you have because you are my son. And I love you as my son, but think before you act. All your dorm pranks and all of your, it will reflect on me. And it's the same thing when we're in relationship with God. What we do reflects on Him.
That's right.
And our job is to enhance the reputation of our God. That nothing that we do should detract from the reputation of our God. And I'm afraid we've done that very poorly as God's people. Do you see what is gained when you take it out of your presuppositions and start to plug it into the framework of their cultural river? Now, that also helps us to recognize that the Torah does not come as, here is a moral system, here is legislation. It comes, here are your stipulations for being in covenant relationship with me. These are covenant stipulations. That's how they're framed in the book. That means no one who is not Israel would be connected to those. Have you noticed in Scripture that the other nations are never condemned or judged for worshiping idols? They're told that it won't do them any good. They're told that their gods really don't have any power. But they're never condemned or judged for worshiping idols. Because they weren't told any differently. Bing, bing. They're never told any differently. And God doesn't hold them responsible for that. This is for Israel. Their covenant stipulations. They describe what was current in Israel and convey the reputation that Yahweh wishes to present for Himself in the context of the ancient Near East. Torah is not given as an ideal system. It is a culturally situated system. What would bring enhancement to the reputation of Yahweh among the nations of the ancient Near East? That explains why we do not find in the Torah any discussion of, is it a good thing to have slaves? Those aren't issues on the table in the ancient world. And Torah is not going to deal with them. It's not presenting an ideal system. It's telling them how to live in the system that exists in their day. There's no discussion about whether democracy might be a more humane government than monarchy. We talked about this some yesterday. There's no discussion of whether patriarchy and male domination is a sensible thing. That's how it was in the ancient world. God wasn't trying to create a new social system for them. He was trying to tell them how to live without reproach in the systems that existed. So we don't have to worry about this slam against Christianity and against the Bible. Oh, a God who condones slavery, a God who condones, the submission of women, the God who does this or that. He's working in a culture, not in an ideal world. And these are stipulations for those people. So, I would suggest that Torah is aspective. They're just illustrations, not intended to be comprehensive, not intended as legislation, not intended as a moral system. Please hear me carefully on this. I've been criticized on this. I'm not saying there's nothing in the Torah that helps us think about morality, or that the Torah has no impact on us thinking about morality. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it does not deliver a moral system. That is not its objective. Okay? There are implications for morality, of course. But that's a different kind of thing. Okay? Their instruction in wisdom to properly serve as a royal vassal. That's what Israel is. That's what the covenants are, treaties, and they're royal vassals. And so they are to please their suzerain. They delineate relationships by circumscribing and describing, not by legislating. So you can see why I don't like to call it the law. The law gives every wrong implication. It's not a comprehensive list of everything expected of a vassal. And you can see this when you look at all of the treaties from the ancient Near East. I've done it. You look at all of the treaty stipulations. They are not comprehensive at all. They're very summary. They're just a few key issues. But the fact is, the vassal is supposed to be loyal to the suzerain in every possible way. And here's a couple of examples. But don't stop there. Be creative. Every possible way. And you can be called on the carpet by the suzerain, even though you didn't violate any of those specifics, because there's other things that you can do that would be disloyal. Your obligation is loyalty and faithfulness, not keeping this little list. And that's the same thing with Torah. These are covenant stipulations. So it's not a comprehensive list of everything expected, but it gives you a general idea of what's involved. In the ancient world, taking a vassal enhanced the reputation of the suzerain. Okay, so for a suzerain, read David's empire. He has all these vassals, okay, that are part of his kingdom. That enhances his reputation. Shows that God is with him. And so when God takes a vassal, Israel as his people, the idea is that his reputation should be enhanced. That's a very technical way of saying what the Bible calls a light to the nations. A light to the nations about this God that they serve in covenant relationship. So, Torah is situated. It's situated in the context of the ancient world. Okay, because everything that they talk about is geared toward that world, not our world. So it's situated in the context of the ancient world. It's situated in a context of a covenant between Yahweh and Israel. And you can't extrapolate what's inside the Torah, outside the Torah, without great caution and care and qualification. Because it's given to them in that covenant. It is a covenant stipulation. It is not given as universal law, though we may feel like some of them could and should be universal laws. That's not what it's there for. Remember, what are we trying to do when we hold ourselves accountable to the authority? We're trying to understand the truth claims that the author had. And the truth claims in the covenant, in Torah, are tied into this covenant relationship that was understood by Israel and its context. Those are the truth claims. A legal system is not the truth claims. Because they didn't see them that way. It all has to do with the presence of Yahweh. And this is another situated in context. Context of the ancient world. Context of the covenant. Context of the presence of Yahweh. As I talked about in the sermon. The covenant is moving toward God reestablishing his presence. Torah is saying, here's how you, Israel, my covenant people, need to order yourselves, your life and your community, to live in my presence. To live in my presence. So it's situated to divine presence. We don't have the presence of God the way they had the presence of God. We don't have the covenant that they had. We're not in the ancient world that they were in. We're in a different world. We've got the presence of God in a different form, and we've got a different relationship with God that's based on a new covenant in Christ. Now, that doesn't mean that the Torah is no good to us. It just says that we have to be careful when we're making those transitions. Because it's very easy to bring over something out of that context that only works in that context. And if we bring it out without that caution, we might end up with results that we shouldn't have. So in the Torah, we find examples of forms that cultic and social order. Notice that's why we have not just moral laws, we have cultic laws, ritual laws. We have civil laws, and we don't separate those out. They're all Torah. It was later theologians, Aquinas, who said, well, boy, we don't offer the sacrifices anymore, so that's civil law, and we don't have to do that. And we're not in the ancient world, that's social law, so we don't have to do that. So we only do the things that are the moral law, and here's what those are. Do you see how that's an imposition of an artificial system? It's Torah. It's not moral and social and ritual. It's Torah. And it all hangs together. So you can't just separate it out so you can throw out 2/3 of it. But likewise, you don't treat it all as somehow moral system. Holiness, I talked about this. So the constellation of divine identity. A status, you're holy because I am holy, co-identifying with Yahweh, and that's reflecting Yahweh's holiness and exalting his reputation. Okay? That's the whole issue with holiness. And I'll leave it up there till I see all the cameras down. Okay. Okay. So, what's the theology now behind this? I've got to wrap up, head for the airport. But what's the theology? It provides wisdom for establishing order to exalt Yahweh's reputation. See, the wisdom, order, Yahweh's reputation that comes out of covenant relationship. Okay? Its revelation and uniqueness is not found in the legal sayings. You shall not murder is not revelation. But all of those things like you shall not murder, now built into covenant stipulations that talk about how Israel is supposed to operate in the presence of God. The new part is not the legal saying. The new part is its context in the covenant stipulations and living in the presence of God. So it's embedded in the covenant. Living in sacred space. Holiness of Yahweh's reputation. Okay? Those are the kinds of things that it's getting at. Again, you can see where we've gone far away from the concept of law. So, cameras, oh, they're still out, okay? Okay, so Torah offers Israel wisdom to guide them in forging an identity that correlates with the holy status they were given when they were designated the people of God. That's what Torah is for. That's what it does. The Israelites didn't see it as law. They don't have such a thing in the ancient world. The Pharisees tried to make it law. And furthermore, tried to see it as a way of salvation, as you could get to heaven by preserving your status in the covenant. So Paul had to argue against it being law. But that's because that's what the Jews were doing in his day. Certainly we, God's people through the new covenant, should not try to treat it as law or turn it into law for ourselves. It never was that. Now, we're not going to have time to do the Decalogue, but I do want to get to the last slide here. Okay, sorry, I'd love to do the Decalogue. The book, The Lost World of Torah, has an appendix where I go through the whole Decalogue and work this out through the whole thing. But I have to go to... let's see, how do I get to... No, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to the slide. Slide. What slide do I want? Man. See all slides. Okay, and go to, that's not giving me it. Sorry, I'm sorry, I don't usually skip like this, so I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, I'm going to do it this way. End show, and then go to the end, and pull up this slide, which is the one that I want. Okay, so here I've talked about what then is Torah to us. Okay, so Torah offers us, okay, this is not Israel anymore. This is us. How do we use the Torah if it's not our covenant and we're not in the ancient world? Torah offers us wisdom to understand the scope and range of holiness, to guide us in forging an identity that correlates with the holy status that we have been given as the people of God in Christ. So it's not something that you pull out sentence by sentence of the Torah and say, how do I do this as a Christian? How do I do this as a Christian? We rather kind of look at the whole, just like you say, this is art. Okay, now I'm supposed to appreciate art. This gives me a guide to thinking about holiness and my responsibility and my identity and status that God has given me. Because everything that I do should enhance the reputation of the God that I serve in the covenant that I am in. So it kind of works by analogy, but not on a point by point, but rather on the whole scale. So that's the basic thrust of it. Again, this is covered in the Lost World of the Torah. It's also discussed some in Lost World of Scripture, and I've got a section on it in my Old Testament theology for Christians as well. So I have to stop there. I'm sorry, I can't even really give a lot of time for questions because I need to head for the airport. Sure. Yeah, John Walton at wheaton.edu.